carried pepper spray, a flashlight, and a walkie-talkie. School policy, nothing more. What the badge didn't show was the Delta Force tattoo hidden under his sleeve, or the instincts that had kept him alive in the world's darkest corners for 2 decades. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of hidden warriors and unexpected protection, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who guard what matters most. Lincoln High School was like any other suburban school in America. Brick buildings, manicured lawns, and the constant hum of teenagers navigating the complex social ecosystem of adolescence. The morning routine was always the same: buses arriving, cars dropping off, students streaming through the main entrance with backpacks slung over shoulders and phones glued to their hands. And standing by the front doors every single morning was Mike Chen. To the 2,400 students and 150 faculty members at Lincoln High, Mike was simply the security guard. Friendly, quiet, and reassuringly present, he wore the standard-issue navy blue uniform with a Lincoln High patch on one shoulder and his name tag on the other. His equipment belt held the basics: pepper spray, flashlight, radio, and a set of master keys that jangled softly as he walked the halls. Mike had been at Lincoln for 3 years, hired after the previous security guard retired. His background check was clean, his references solid, and his interview had impressed Principal Martinez with its combination of military bearing and genuine concern for student safety. He was exactly what they were looking for: experienced, professional, and unassuming. What they didn't know was that Mike Chen's military bearing came from 22 years in the U.S. Army, with the last 12 years spent in Delta Force, the most elite special operations unit in the American military. The man who now carried pepper spray and walked teenagers to the nurse's office had once carried custom weapons through hostile territory, conducting operations so classified that they didn't exist in any official record. The transition from Delta Force operator to high school security guard might seem dramatic, but for Mike, it made perfect sense. After 2 decades of protecting America's interests around the world, he wanted to protect America's future at home. And where better to do that than in a place filled with the next generation of leaders, innovators, and dreamers. Mike's day began at 6:30 a.m., an hour before the first bus arrived. He would walk the entire perimeter of the school, checking doors, windows, and sight lines. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine security check. In reality, Mike was conducting a tactical assessment, using skills honed in environments where a single oversight could mean death. He knew every entrance and exit, every blind spot, every potential choke point. He had memorized the daily schedules of every teacher, the movement patterns of maintenance staff, and the typical behavior of students in different areas of the building. What looked like friendly familiarity was actually the product of operational awareness that had been drilled into him through years of high-stakes missions. "Morning, Mr. Mike," Sarah Williams would call out as she hurried through the front doors, usually running late for her first period chemistry class. "Good morning, Sarah. Don't forget your lab goggles today," Mike would reply with a warm smile, remembering that she'd gotten in trouble the week before for forgetting her safety equipment. These interactions weren't just pleasantries. Mike knew every student who struggled academically, every kid who came from a difficult home situation, every teenager who might be dealing with depression or anxiety. He watched for signs of trouble, not because it was his job, but because protection had become his nature. The other staff members appreciated Mike's thoroughness, though they attributed it to simple diligence rather than professional training. Principal Martinez often commented that she'd never had a security guard who was so detail-oriented, so aware of everything happening in the building. "Mike notices everything," she would tell visiting administrators. "He knows if a light bulb burns out before maintenance does. He can tell you which students are having a bad day just by watching them walk down the hall." What Martinez didn't realize was that Mike's observational skills had been developed in places where noticing everything was the difference between completing a mission and never coming home. The ability to read body language, detect anomalies, and predict behavior wasn't just useful in combat zones. It was invaluable in a high school environment where early intervention could prevent tragedies. 3 weeks into the spring semester, Mike began noticing something that made his combat-trained instincts go on high alert. It started with small things that most people would dismiss as coincidental. A van with tinted windows had been parked across from the school for 3 days running, always during dismissal time. The same 2 men in different clothes had walked past the school's main entrance twice in 1 week, both times paying unusually close attention to the security cameras and entry points. And most concerning of all, he'd noticed someone taking photographs of the building from the public park across the street. Any one of these incidents could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that Mike recognized from his years in counterterrorism operations. Someone was conducting surveillance. Mike had faced this decision before, in foreign countries where the stakes were national security and the rules of engagement were clearly defined. But this was different. This was a high school in suburban America where raising alarms without concrete proof could cause panic, damage careers, and potentially traumatize thousands of students. He began his own counter-surveillance operation, using skills that most people assumed had been left behind in his military career. He documented license plates, photographed suspicious individuals from a distance, and began varying his patrol routes to gather better intelligence, all while maintaining the appearance of a friendly security guard going about his normal duties. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon. Mike was reviewing security camera footage from the previous week when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. One of the men he'd been watching had been on campus before, not as a visitor, but in older footage from 6 months earlier. He'd posed as a delivery driver, spending nearly an hour inside the building under the pretense of delivering office supplies. That meant reconnaissance had been ongoing for months. Whatever was being planned, it was sophisticated, well-funded, and targeted specifically at Lincoln High School. Mike had 2 choices: report his suspicions to local law enforcement and hope they took him seriously, or take matters into his own hands using methods that weren't exactly covered in the school security handbook. He chose a third option: prepare for both. The next morning, Mike arrived at work carrying his usual equipment, but with some modifications that would have alarmed anyone who knew what to look for. His flashlight had been replaced with a tactical model that could serve as an impact weapon. His radio now included an emergency frequency used by federal agencies. And hidden beneath his uniform, barely visible even to trained eyes, was body armor that he'd kept from his military service. More importantly, Mike began implementing security measures that went far beyond his official duties. He identified defensive positions throughout the school building, mapped emergency evacuation routes that weren't included in the official fire drill procedures, and established cache points where additional equipment could be stored if needed. To the staff and students, these changes were invisible. Mike remained the same friendly, approachable security guard he'd always been. But beneath the surface, Lincoln High School was being transformed into something that resembled a soft target, hardened by a professional who understood exactly how such places could be attacked. Mike also did something that would have surprised anyone who knew his military background. He began reaching out to local law enforcement, not to report his suspicions, but to build relationships that might be crucial if his fears proved justified. He volunteered to help with the school's emergency response drills, sharing suggestions that were actually tactical improvements based on his special operations experience. He attended community policing meetings, quietly establishing himself as a resource that local officers could rely on. And he made sure that the school's emergency contact procedures included direct lines to agencies that could respond faster than standard 911 protocols. None of this violated his cover or revealed his true background. To everyone else, Mike Chen was simply a security guard who took his job seriously. But in reality, Lincoln High School now had defensive preparations that would have impressed his former Delta Force teammates. March 15th started like any other day. Mike arrived at 6:30 a.m., conducted his perimeter check, and took his position by the front doors as students began arriving for classes. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of energy that comes with the approaching end of winter and the promise of spring break. At 7:45 a.m., as Mike was greeting the last of the early arrivals, his tactical awareness kicked into overdrive. The same van he'd been monitoring was back, but this time it was positioned differently, closer to the building and angled for rapid departure. More concerning, he could see movement inside that suggested multiple occupants. Then he spotted them. 3 men walking across the parking lot toward the main entrance, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that Mike recognized immediately. They were dressed in dark clothing, carrying large duffel bags and maintaining tactical spacing that no civilian would think to use. Mike's Delta Force training took over instantly. In the space of 2 heartbeats, he assessed the threat, calculated response options, and made a decision that would save hundreds of lives. Instead of unlocking the main doors for the start of the school day, Mike triggered the school's lockdown protocol. The electronic locks engaged with a soft click that most people wouldn't have noticed. The hallways, which should have been filled with students heading to first period, remained clear as automated announcements directed everyone to remain in their current locations. And Mike Chen, mild-mannered security guard, began moving with the fluid precision of a special operations soldier preparing for combat. The attackers reached the main entrance expecting to find unlocked doors and helpless targets. Instead, they found reinforced glass, electronic security systems, and a man who was already 3 steps ahead of their planning. Mike watched through the security monitor as the lead attacker tried the door handles, his frustration visible even through the camera feed. The 3 men regrouped, pulling what appeared to be weapons from their duffel bags. Mike's worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't a robbery or a personal vendetta. This was a planned attack on the school. But these attackers had made a critical error in their intelligence gathering. They had planned for standard school security measures, unlocked doors, minimal resistance, and response times measured in minutes rather than seconds. They hadn't planned for someone who could think like they did and react faster than they could adapt. Mike activated the school's emergency broadcast system, but not to announce a lockdown drill. In a calm, clear voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders under pressure, he spoke directly to his hidden opponents. This is security. The building is locked down, law enforcement has been notified, and federal agencies are en route. You have 30 seconds to leave the premises before the situation escalates beyond your ability to control. It was a bluff, but a professional one. Mike knew that most attackers in these situations were operating on adrenaline and bravado rather than tactical sophistication. The suggestion that they faced organized resistance and imminent capture would either cause them to flee or force them to act rashly. They chose to act rashly. The sound of gunfire shattered the morning quiet as the attackers attempted to shoot through the reinforced glass of the main entrance. The glass held, another modification that Mike had quietly suggested during his tenure at the school, but it wouldn't hold forever. Mike had perhaps 2 minutes before they found another way in, and another 3 minutes before they realized that most of the building's occupants were secured behind classroom doors that could be barricaded from the inside. That gave him 5 minutes to end this before it became a siege. 5 minutes was more than enough. What happened next would be reconstructed later from security camera footage, witness statements, and physical evidence. But none of those sources could fully capture the transformation that took place as Mike Chen stopped being a security guard and became what he had always been underneath, a weapon designed by the U.S. military for situations exactly like this. Mike moved through the school building using routes and methods that no attacker would anticipate. He knew every maintenance corridor, every emergency exit, and every blind spot in the security camera coverage. More importantly, he understood how to use the building itself as both cover and weapon. The attackers had split up, trying to find alternative entrances while maintaining radio contact with each other. This was a tactical error that Mike exploited immediately. Rather than trying to defend multiple positions, he used their separation against them, engaging each attacker individually in environments where his superior training and knowledge of the terrain gave him overwhelming advantages. The first attacker tried to enter through a side door that Mike had already secured and was monitoring. The man spent crucial minutes trying to breach the entrance, while Mike positioned himself for an ambush that ended before the attacker realized he was no longer the hunter, but but the hunted. The second attacker made it inside through a service entrance, but found himself in an unfamiliar building, facing someone who knew every corner and shadow. The pursuit lasted less than 30 seconds and ended in a maintenance corridor where no security cameras would record the details. The third attacker, hearing no response from his teammates, tried to flee back to the van. He made it halfway across the parking lot before Mike caught up with him, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had tracked targets across much more challenging terrain than suburban asphalt. By the time the first police cars arrived, exactly 6 minutes and 40 seconds after Mike had triggered the lockdown, the threat had been neutralized and the school was secure. 3 attackers who had planned to commit mass murder instead found themselves face to face with a level of opposition they couldn't have imagined in their worst nightmares. In the hours that followed, Lincoln High School became the center of a media storm that reached national proportions. The story of a school attack that had been stopped before it could begin was unprecedented, and everyone wanted to understand how disaster had been averted. Principal Martinez found herself fielding questions from reporters, FBI agents, and Department of Homeland Security officials who all wanted to know the same thing. How had their security guard known to lock down the school before the attack began? Mike is very observant, she told them, repeating the same explanation she'd given dozens of times. He noticed suspicious activity and took appropriate precautions. But as investigators dug deeper into the events of that morning, they began to realize that Mike Chen's response had been far more sophisticated than the actions of a typical security guard. The tactical decision-making, the use of building systems as defensive tools, and the efficient neutralization of multiple armed attackers suggested training and experience that went well beyond standard security protocols. It was FBI agent Sarah Rodriguez who finally made the connection. While reviewing Mike's employment records for the third time, she noticed something that everyone else had missed, a gap in his work history that coincided exactly with the period when Delta Force had conducted its most classified operations in the Middle East. "We need to talk to Mr. Chen," she told her supervisor. "I don't think we're dealing with a security guard who got lucky. I think we're dealing with someone who was waiting for exactly this situation." The interview took place in the principal's office 3 days after the attack, with Mike sitting calmly across from Agent Rodriguez and 2 other federal investigators. He had maintained his mild-mannered demeanor throughout the crisis, deflecting praise and avoiding media attention with the same consistency he'd shown in greeting students every morning. "Mr. Chen," Agent Rodriguez began, "we've been reviewing your actions during the attack, and we have some questions about your background." Mike nodded quietly. "I figured you would. Your employment application lists previous security work and military service, but it's not specific about the nature of that military service. Would you mind elaborating?" Mike was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there during his 3 years as a school security guard. 22 years, U.S. Army. The last 12 with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. The room went completely silent. Agent Rodriguez felt her understanding of the previous week's events shift dramatically. "Delta Force," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am." "And you've been working as a high school security guard for 3 years." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Mike looked out the window toward the student parking lot, where teenagers were returning to something approaching normal routine after the most terrifying week in their school's history. "Because this is what I was protecting when I was overseas," he said simply. "Seemed like I should keep protecting it when I came home." Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, you stopped a mass casualty event using methods that probably saved hundreds of lives. The FBI would like to discuss opportunities for you to share your expertise with other schools, other security professionals." Mike shook his head gently. "Respectfully, Agent Rodriguez, I already have a job." "You want to stay here? As a security guard?" "I want to stay here as their security guard," Mike corrected. "These kids don't need me to be anywhere else. They need me to be here every morning, making sure they're safe." He stood up, straightening his navy blue uniform shirt with the Lincoln High patch on the shoulder. "If that's all, I need to get back to work. The afternoon dismissal rush starts in 20 minutes, and the kids get anxious if I'm not at my usual post. Mike Chen returned to his position by the front doors that afternoon, just as he had every day for 3 years. To the students and staff, he was still Mr. Mike, friendly, reliable, and reassuringly present. But now there was something else in the way people looked at him, a recognition that the man who had saved their lives was someone far more complex than they had ever imagined. The story of Lincoln High School's security guard spread through military communities with the speed that only true legends achieve. Delta Force operators shared it in secure communications, special operations veterans discussed it at reunions, and active duty soldiers added it to the collection of stories that define what it means to be a warrior in peacetime. But Mike himself remained exactly who he had always been, a protector who measured success not by recognition received, but by harm prevented. He continued to arrive at 6:30 a.m., continued to greet students by name, and continued to watch over Lincoln High School with the quiet vigilance of someone who understood that the most important battles are often the ones that never get fought. 3 months after the attack, the school board voted to install a small plaque near the main entrance. It didn't mention Mike by name or describe the events of that March morning. It simply read, "Dedicated to those who stand watch so others may learn in safety." Mike saw the plaque being installed during his morning perimeter check. He paused for a moment, reading the inscription, then continued his rounds. There was work to do, students to protect, and a promise to keep. Some warriors fight battles that change the course of history. Others prevent battles that would change history in ways too terrible to imagine. Both kinds of service matter. Both kinds of warriors deserve to be remembered. But the second kind often prefer to be forgotten, to blend back into the civilian world they've sworn to protect, carrying their vigilance quietly and their weapons concealed until the moment when they're needed most. Years later, Mike Chen still walks the halls of Lincoln High School. He's older now, his hair more gray than black, his step slightly slower than it was during his Delta Force days. But his eyes remain sharp, his awareness constant, and his commitment absolute. The students who were freshmen during the attack are now graduating seniors. They remember that March morning, but for them, Mr. Mike isn't the man who saved their lives. He's simply the security guard who's always been there, who knows their names and asks about their classes and makes them feel safe in a world that sometimes doesn't. New students arrive each year, unaware of the legend who checks their IDs and reminds them about dress code violations. To them, Mike is just part of the school, as permanent and reassuring as the brick walls and the bell tower. And that's exactly how Mike prefers it, because the best security is invisible until it's needed. The best protection comes from someone who hopes never to have to prove their capabilities. And the best warriors are often the ones who've learned that the greatest victory is the battle that never has to be fought. So Mike continues his watch, continues his service, continues to be the guardian that Lincoln High School never knew it needed until the day it needed him most. And somewhere in a classified file in a federal building, there's a report that ends with a simple recommendation. Subject should be left in place. His current assignment appears to be exactly where he belongs. Have you ever met someone like Mike Chen? Someone who seemed ordinary but carried extraordinary capabilities? Someone who chose to serve quietly, without recognition, because service itself was its own reward? Share their story in the comments. Tell us how they protected, taught, or inspired you. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Daily Soldier Stories. We're here to honor not just the warriors who fight in distant lands, but the guardians who stand watch in our everyday places. Because heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear name tags, carry flashlights, and spend their days making sure the next generation feels safe enough to learn and grow. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, the best protection often comes from the most unexpected places.